Hi everyone, welcome to our next session on empowering women informal entrepreneurs, credit, skills, and enabling environment. Okay. So what we have learned from previous sections is that there's a lot of women in the non-agricultural labor who are self-employed. So for example, in Africa, this figure is estimated to be 63%. And a lot of those female-run enterprises are small, informal, home-based, and primarily focused on like traditional sectors, including service and retail, or like a lot of them are so-called these like nano stores, as we heard from the previous section. And they face a lot of constraints, not only include those like well-known ones, like credit constraint or lack of skills, but also a lot of challenges from like how to balance their work and home and how to get more support from their spouse, etc. So given that this population constitutes an important part of the economy, it's important to think about how can we help them to solve those barriers. And we are lucky to have four experts in this panel talking about this issue. So let me briefly introduce them first. So this is Ben Ross, who is an associate professor at Harvard Business School and Jaipur affiliate. So he works with microfinance institutions around the world to study issues related to financial inclusion and microenterprise growth. Then this is Manuela Angelucci, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of Texas at Austin and Jaipur affiliate. So her research interest spans mental health, consumption, risk sharing, gender, and migration. And then we have Françoise Carey, who is a research director of the Center for Social Policy, University of Massachusetts, Boston's Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. She's also the statistics program director of the Global Research Action Network Women in Informal Employment, Globalization, and Organizing. And her expertise includes applied labor economics and comparative employment relations. And lastly, we also have Nkachi Wu, who unfortunately cannot join us in person today. So she is an associate professor of economics at the University of Ghana, but is currently visiting the World Bank. So she is unable to join us because of a family emergency, but she very nicely prepared video, which we are going to deliver now.
Hello everyone, my name is Nkachi and I'm pleased to be making a contribution during this very important session. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, which provides sort of a background to the study that I'm going to be talking about. So my JPOP funded project is titled Work and Family, Experiments to Minimize Role Conflicts and Enhance Business Performance Among Women Entrepreneurs in Ghana. Now, the idea for this project came about from a project that I was involved in as far back as 2014, titled Gender and Enterprise Development in Africa. The main objective was to try to outline the different barriers that affected men and women's medium, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in Ghana. Now, when asked what some of these limitations were, a lot of the traditional factors were mentioned. Things like limited access to credit, something I think Ben is going to be talking a bit more about. Things like limited access to infrastructure, water, electricity. But an important focus of this project was trying to pay attention to particularly female entrepreneurs and what the role of family was in their business success or business experiences. Now, some of the women that we interviewed, and we collated responses from a lot of all of the regions of the country, from as many as close to 1,500 respondents. And some of our female respondents were of the view that indeed their male partners and family members had been supportive. But we found out that this position was not universal. In many cases, women actually intimated that family presented a lot of challenges to the successful running and expansion of their businesses. There was an important role that social norms and cultural expectations played that had not been well recognized or addressed within the existing literature. Now, some of the reasons that the women mentioned have been outlined in this slide. So, for example, some women mentioned that they were forced to close their businesses early as 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Even though there were customers, they knew that they would have more customers later on in the day. And the reason it was important to close early was because they had to go back and see to domestic and household responsibilities. As we know, in this setting, there's the cultural expectations that says that women are responsible for the housework. And so therefore they had to close early and go and see to these responsibilities. Additionally, culturally, it's not encouraged for women to stay out beyond a certain hour because it might raise perceptions of inappropriate behavior. And for that reason, women also had to close earlier than they felt was useful, because then they lost out on customers. Secondly, women also mentioned that they were not free to travel, outside of their immediate communities in search of other customers. They couldn't leave their communities without permission of their male partners, and what it meant was that they couldn't go out and look for, other customers, expand their market base, which of course has implications for the expansion and growth of their businesses. Some women also mentioned that they were not allowed, if you will, to have members of the opposite sex as customers, again, for fear of being accused of having inappropriate relationships. So essentially cutting out about half of their potential client base. And when asked, what types of interventions would be helpful for these women to try to grow their businesses, we were initially very surprised when some women responded that they did not have an interest in growing their business. They actually preferred to stay small. Of course, we probed and we asked why this was the case. And they mentioned that oftentimes, if a woman was perceived as being too successful, it might create problems for her within her marriage, within the household. Because male partners, perhaps because they feel, for certain reasons, maybe they feel threatened by, their female partner's success, they start to believe that, females are more disrespectful. Perhaps it happens in actuality, but what it means is that there's a lot more arguments, and head-butting when a woman is perceived, within the household as being too successful. Men feel as if it also comes with a lot of arrogance and disrespect, and therefore it leads to marital issues. And in the extreme, it can even lead to marital dissolution. So women expressed these views as to why they prefer to stay small. They also said that if they were perceived as being successful, men would withdraw their support for household needs, therefore leaving it primarily on the women to cater for. And sometimes this would mean that they had to delve into their company profits, to be used on household expenditures. So for these reasons, they just felt there was little incentive, to try to expand their business further. So it is on the back of this study that the J-POW project was born. So essentially, the question was, how can we try to remove some of these cultural barriers? And the way that we approached this was trying to focus on male partners. So we provided an intervention that is a psychosocial training for male partners. So we bring the man and the woman together and would administer this training and also let them play, a variety of games meant at trying to emphasize that actually when a woman's business is beneficial, it can help to the improved well-being of not just the woman herself, but the male partner and then the other household members at large. Now, this is a project that is still ongoing. It started last year, and we hope to complete it later this year. We're actually going into the field to collect the end-line survey next month. And some of the outcomes of interest are, first of all, to see if after receiving the training, men actually spend more time helping out their partners in domestic and childcare responsibilities, therefore freeing up women's time to take care of their business ventures. We also wanted to see whether there was, as a result of receiving the training, male partners extended more help with respect to the business contributions, be it in kind or in cash. And then finally, we're also intending to monitor business performance by women, paying attention to things like their business sales, their business revenues, to see if the training or the intervention had any measurable impact. So this is the project that we are involved in at the moment. I'm very pleased to share it with you. And once the final report is ready, it will be provided to JPAL, and I'm sure that it will be shared with you, their valuable stakeholders. So I'd like to bring my presentation on the project to a close. I do have a couple of questions for my fellow panel members, and I'll start with a couple for Ben. So Ben, there's a lot of rationale, right, for improving access to credit, because this is aimed at increasing women's business performance. I wondered if there are other important considerations. So for example, what effect might microcredit have on things like women's autonomy and independence within their households? Have there been any noted adverse effects? And then overall, is there evidence of long-term effects of these credit interventions on women's business performance? For Manuela, I was wondering if there are any differences in experiences for young compared to older women, and also by marital status, as well as differences in socio-economic status like education and then income. I was also curious as to whether women tend to be discouraged from entering specific, maybe technical areas in the informal sector. And is violence a potential consequence of their entry? Are there any NGOs or interventions that you are aware of in the space trying to encourage more involvement of women in these, so-called forbidden areas? And then for Francois, the digital revolution has been touted as being one way of increasing women's entrepreneurial outcomes, for example, through the use of social media and other means. In your view, has the digital revolution lived up to expectations in this context? And then we also have climate change, another factor that has been known to have some gender effects. How are women adapting to climate change, if at all, with respect to their businesses in the informal sector? So thank you very much for allowing me to make a contribution to this session, and thank you to my fellow panel members on what I'm sure has been very interesting presentations. I look forward to hearing from you on any feedback that you may have. I'm sure that the organizers will share my contact details. So thank you very much, and my presentation is ended.
I guess we will send a thank you message to Nkechi after the workshop. And it's really nice that she prepared such a wonderful set of questions for our panelists. But I think it might be better for us to firstly hear our panelist presentation, and then maybe we can leave those questions afterwards. So I guess some points that pointed out in Nkechi's presentation is very relevant to Ben's research on microcredit, right? So, for example, a lot of microcredit programs targeted on female entrepreneurs, but we actually did not see the impact is bigger on women compared with their male counterparties. And one reason could be because of those cultural or social norms that Nkechi mentioned. Women might be forced to, for example, share some of the resources with their husband or spend some of it on the household expenditures. So there has been some novel tools in the microcredit field, trying to improve the impact of microcredit on women through, for example, tools of targeting or novel delivery methodologies. So Ben, can you tell us some of your frontier research in this area?
Yeah, sure. So I'll plan to talk much more broadly than just about my own work. As a point of sort of context and the perspective where I'm coming from, I've been doing work in this area for about a decade, working closely with microfinance institutions around the world. So that's one hat that I bring, my research hat. And then the other hat that I now wear is that Natalia Regal and I run a startup microfinance institution in South India. And so for the last year and a half, that's afforded me a very different view into a lot of these issues. And so what I share with you today is sort of the intersection of those two perspectives. I think many of you are aware of the rigorous body of RCTs that were sort of the first wave of evidence on the classic microfinance model, and it found moderately good things, but microfinance didn't reach the bar we hoped it would in terms of empowering livelihoods, and relevant for today, especially of women. And so over the last decade or so, there have been many strands of new work that have emerged from that, exploring different facets of how you might do better, and I wanted to talk about, I guess, 3. The first are graduation loans. And so here, what I am referring to are loans that are, you take a microfinance borrower, someone who's doing the standard group lending, small loan, and you take that person and you give them a loan that's between 2 and 5 times as large as the standard microfinance loan. So that's what I mean by graduate. And we have some evidence that if you give that kind of loan to the right borrowers, that can have actually a really big impact on livelihoods. So here I cited 2 studies. I think this is a very new area. It's an area we could use more evidence on. But the first of these is in Pakistan. It had unambiguously positive effects. The second of these is in Egypt, and there the message was a little more nuanced. But at least there was suggestive evidence that some businesses were helped a lot by these larger loans, and some were harmed. Okay, I would call that a little bit speculative, and this is an area where we need to know more. One thing I wanted to say here is this is hard work. So there are a few ways in which this is hard. One of our very closest partners in the microfinance space is the largest microfinance institution in Chile. It's Fondo Esperanza. And for a decade, they had a graduation loan program that they recently shut down because they just couldn't make it financially sustainable or even close. It may sound like giving out bigger loans is a ticket to making more revenues, but once you move away from the group lending model, you're running a very different business. And so we've seen many times microfinance institutions trying to move into this space and failing to make it work. So it's hard to do. One particular way it's hard to do is on screening. So there are 2 ways it's hard to screen. One is you might give these loans to the kinds of people who actually can't use them well, and they have trouble repaying. That's one challenge we've seen. And another challenge we've seen is giving these loans to people who could anyways get small business loans from somewhere else. And so lots of microfinance institutions that we've worked with are basically just competing with the small business lenders in their area rather than truly graduating microfinance clients. And so that's another challenge in this area. I'll leave it there on that one. The second thing I wanted to highlight was flexible credit. So flexibility means a bunch of different things. One thing it means is offering repayment plans that are more closely tailored to a business's needs. So one of the hallmarks of classic microfinance is a very standardized repayment schedule. Everyone in your group pays weekly or biweekly or monthly, and there's very little regard to what are your specific needs. Okay, so for a while now, there's been a lot of experimentation with offering people more personalized repayment plans, and I would say the evidence here is mixed but all promising. It all points in the same direction. So the first of these have found sort of astronomically positive results of offering flexible repayment plans. Very, very large income effects that persisted now for a decade. I would say, as is very common in situations where an intervention shows sort of outstanding promise in its first iteration, that amazing result hasn't proven robust, but certainly it never goes negative. It's not like in these other studies offering flexible repayment is bad. It's always good, but maybe only moderately good. But still, I think this is a very promising area. Another area that I think is very promising relates to flexibility in the mode of disbursement. And so here I wanted to highlight Emma Riley's work, where they randomized whether I give you the loan in cash or whether I distribute it over mobile money. And they found that women who received the loan over mobile money were more able to protect it from sharing norms. This was in Uganda. And so they were more able to invest in their businesses, and it had larger income effects. So I think flexibility there matters a lot. One other thing I wanted to highlight is these alternative methods of screening or identifying which borrowers you want to give your loans to. And once you start moving away from the classic microfinance model, once you start giving larger loans or more personalized loans, it's going to become a lot more important to know who you're lending to and make sure that they can handle these loans. And so here I wanted to highlight 2 strands of my own work where we use alternative modes of screening. Community information, so asking your peers. We did that in Western India. Asking your neighbors, basically, are you a good borrower? Are you a good entrepreneur? In Chile, we asked your loan officers for, this was for a graduation loan, who would be suitable for a graduation loan. And in both of those contexts, we found that the soft information people gave was much more predictive and also differently predictive than the kinds of traditional observable metrics that lenders use and rely on. So I think that's cool. And then I'll just say one last thing here, which is, this is going to vary by context, but at least in South India, where I'm now doing some of this in practice, over-indebtedness is a big concern. there are a lot of settings where microfinance institutions compete fiercely with one another to make loans. And it's actually not uncommon for people to come through our doors, and we are the 4th or 5th lender on their household balance sheet. And this is an area that I think a lot of practitioners are oriented to, but academics a little bit less. And I think in some of these settings, the most impactful thing a lender can do is actually not to make a loan. And so I think being very vigilant about this problem is sort of worth a little more concern among researchers and academics as well. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. So in addition to credit constraints, we may also need to pay attention to female entrepreneurs' vulnerability or mental health. So Manuela, you have a lot of interesting research in this area. So can you share it with us?
Yes. I also have slides. But
You just hit next.
Yeah.
there they are. OK, yes. So I want to talk about 2 themes of my research, one of which is perhaps a bit under the radar for some of you. I want to talk about mental health and violence against women. And before I show you some figures, we can think about these issues within the lens of entrepreneurship. But I think they're broader issues in terms, for example, of learning, skill accumulation and retention, and all the other things that we've talked about today. So sort of keep an open mind. Just a few stats for those of you who are not familiar with this. Depression is really pervasive, and it's also positively correlated with poverty. So just to give you some sense of the importance of this issue, pre-pandemic in industrialized countries, the prevalence of depression is around 5%, give or take 1 or 2 percentage points. Whereas in my research in southern India, this is the left part of the graph. This is the adult population in 3 taluks in the nearby Bangalore. The rates of depression are at least twice as high. So about 10% of the adult population has symptoms that are consistent with major depression disorder, which means that if one of us went to a psychiatrist, we would be put on medication. More than twice as high for people who have some symptoms of depression. Among poor women eligible for multifaceted anti-poverty and empowerment intervention, these rates are much, much higher. So there's about almost 30% of women who have symptoms that are consistent with major depressive disorder, more than twice as many with some symptoms of depression. So this is really, really prevalent. And of course, these are different countries and different contexts, so I'm not suggesting that we do a cross-country comparison. But if we were willing to do, we would find that, again, this is consistent with our knowledge that prevalence increases with poverty, but also the prevalence is much higher among women than men. And so thinking about mental health and depression is also indirectly thinking about gender inequality and how to alleviate it. You might ask, why depression? We're economists, and well, why not? But also, depression has a lot of symptoms that really directly or indirectly impact outcomes that economists are really interested in. You can look at a list of symptoms, but just think about a couple of things. Depression has been shown to impair both physical and cognitive productivity, which can have implications for all the things that we've been talking about. But also, and perhaps even more insidious, one of the key symptoms of depression is anhedonia, which is flat affect. We can think of it as having a utility function that is low and flat, or like people basically not caring too much about life and not engaging with living. And you can think that how people respond to incentives, how people respond to the possibility to invest or to take risks, is completely affected by suffering from this disorder. Moving on to the second source of vulnerability that I want to highlight, this is much more understood and studied, but nevertheless still important to put in the context of entrepreneurship. One of the statistics that are thrown out there is that worldwide, 1 in 3 women over their lifetimes are going to experience at least a spell of sexual or physical violence. In DRC, which is one country that I've studied, the cross-sectional prevalence of depression is, more than 50% in the previous year. So again, this is really staggering. You can look at them, but I think, I don't need to do any more work of convincing you. So as I did before, why do we care? What's the link between, violence against women and entrepreneurship? There are just so many different dimensions, right? It could be, access to the workplace, access to the marketplace. We've covered a few of them. I want to cover another one, which is also the sort of impacts of interventions that we want to do to foster entrepreneurship, but also to foster empowerment, to foster gender development in general. And it is that often hopefully for a minority of women, but for a non-negligible group of women, these interventions end up backfiring. And so we try to empower them, we try to increase entrepreneurship, but we find that actually when they go back, they're victimized more. That's what you can see in the panel on the left. And also that there's a strong link between violence against women and control of resources and income. For example, in DRC, we found that perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, the women whose intervention, for whom the impact of the intervention was a result in higher domestic violence are also the women who ended up not sharing the income that was transferred to them with their husbands. And on the other hand, the other way of thinking about it could be, look, for the women for whom violence went down, we also find that probably this is happening because they're bribing their husbands and their partners not to be violent against them, which poses a host of possible questions about who's gaining, who's benefiting from this intervention, but also could these women's be more enterprises be more profitable? So I was asked to find answers. I have very few, but I have a lot of questions, and my hope is to kind of spur a conversation, but also make you all curious and wanting to investigate them more. We know a little bit, and what I mean a little bit in that we have a large enough body of evidence that we can start to draw general conclusions about things like can programs that foster entrepreneurship and empowerment improve mental health? It can, but we don't know yet exactly how and when and why. And can these programs improve violence against women? Then we also have evidence that yes, but as I said, it's kind of a little bit tricky because some women might actually become more vulnerable for that. There's a lot of stuff that I think is really interesting and relevant that we don't have a good sense about. So for example, sorry, I need to read them because I forget everything, but that's why I wrote them down. So why do mental health and violence against women how do violence and mental health affect program uptake and impacts? And you can read the rest. I know my time's up, so hopefully you guys are curious and want to talk more about it.
Thank you. So what we have learned so far seems like women entrepreneurs may also need a broader enabling environment necessary for their business to grow. And at the same time, we may also need better data on those female entrepreneurs in order to get a more detailed study on this population. And Françoise, I know you are working on some novel survey and statistical tools in this dimension. So can you share some of your experience with us?
Sure. Well, I'll put my one single slide up just so you keep me on target, on focus. So thank you for having us. And I speak here on behalf of WIGO, which stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and just wanted to say 2 words about it. It's a global research and policy network that focuses on the working poor in the informal economy, particularly women. And we do our work in collaboration with global and regional networks of member-based organizations of informal workers. And these are organizations that represent groups of workers like street vendors, which are micro, nano retailers, market traders, domestic workers, home-based workers, which is a very large group, and waste pickers. These are the ones we focus on. There are others, but these are sort of big. They represent the bulk of informal employment, in particularly in urban areas. And we have 5 programs: 1 on organization and representation, 1 on statistics, urban policies, social protection, law. And we have a cross-function in research. So I just thought I would speak about the context in which women informal operators do their work. And just kind of say something about why on the WeGo side we tend to be a bit skeptical about interventions that focus almost exclusively on skill training or microcredit, and why they run into some obstacles. So just a clarification, because we're not all on the same page necessarily about what informal means. It essentially means being unregistered and unincorporated if one is an entrepreneur. And for an employee, it means not having access to some kind of some protection, regulatory protection, in particular social protection. So just a quick global fact: self-employment, which is what we've been asked to talk about, represents a far higher share of total employment. In low-income countries, it's about 72%. In emerging economies, just about 50%. And in developed countries, it's only 14%. In high-income countries, it's only about 14%, according to the ILO. A larger share of women workers than male workers are self-employed. And the thing to call attention to is that self-employment is, when we talk about it, it's actually it's a grab bag. It's a really heterogeneous category. It includes employers. It includes what we call own-account workers, meaning they operate by themselves. But there's also a group in between that are neither employers, nor account workers, nor employees. And they're what statistics practitioners are starting to call dependent contractors, meaning think of the woman that is getting a supply from a representative of a larger operator, and they have to produce on specs. So garment worker is probably the best example in a domestic chain or a global chain. And then it also includes contributing family workers, and that's important because women that sometimes run the family household enterprise get categorized in statistics as contributing family workers, where in fact they actually run the thing. And it's also heterogeneous by class. I mean, they are non-poor, mainly employers, and then they are working poor in own account and dependent contractor and contributing family worker status. And of course, women are overrepresented among the own account operators and family workers, and underrepresented among employers. And when they do, they have one employee maybe. The sectors, the kind of occupations, I mean, we heard about some of these today. There's petty trade and commerce, light manufacturing, craft manufacturing, food and beverage processing, but also personal services, which is something we see more of when we look at statistics. Just three things, something to say about WeGo's approach, which I think feeds into the discussion about enabling conditions. We have sort of three leitmotifs or factors that we think about. One is visibility. For the longest time, just getting labor force statistics on how many workers operate in those ways was quite difficult. So it was work with national statisticians and international statisticians around questions for labor force surveys, trying to get anything in enterprise surveys to cover very small operators. Second is voice. That means collective organization and representation in policymaking and rule-setting institutions. It may mean, negotiating to maintain safe and accessible vending space, seeking participation in urban regulatory bodies around use of space, advocating for improved infrastructure in informal settlements where people work as home-based workers, and pushing for inclusion in social protection schemes when the notion of universal social protection is on the docket for policymakers. So, and the third is validity, the idea of getting official recognition as economic agents. So I was asked to talk about uses of statistics, but also about enabling conditions. And given that there are 2 minutes, you need to tell me what you would like to hear. Okay, that's what I thought. All right. There's small entrepreneurs often on their own. The constraints they face are the same as other operators, except that they have they have difficulty around getting supportive infrastructure, meaning being home-based means that access to water and sanitation and electricity is quite important. Public infrastructure, particularly transportation, is important. And then the inhospitable wider environment, where home-based workers might gather into a cooperative, but they do not get to bid in procurement contracts, for example. And then women have additional constraints like limited property rights, so they don't have equity for collateral. And of course, the social norms that have come up already with operating in public often, particularly street vendors and market traders. The risks that they face are, again, similar to many others that operate in business, but for them it's a lack of contract enforcement because they're informal. And also the unpredictable legal and policy environment. We saw that with COVID, but there's also sort of pushes of law and order pushes which really control how much they can do. And then for women entrepreneurs, again, some of these items came up too. Verbal harassment, both at home in the neighborhood and in the street, and also sexual harassment as well, both in public and with some business partners. So addressing these constraints, I mean, I think, and these risks, I think that the systemic challenges are many. I think that the way that we go at it is probably, goes at it is probably a good way to go through organization representation and support to advocacy, to policy advocacy. But beyond and in addition to sort of microcredit and training and other things that we're all thinking about, relevant research and development to foster productivity increases, because we hear all the time that is the major issue. Addressing exclusion from economic development plans, starting with local economic development plans. We often hear that women informal operators are a lost cause because of their low productivity. I mean, I certainly hear that in economics meetings all the time. But what we see is that informal sector operators are often used as suppliers to formal sector firms, and sometimes even large ones. The other kind of category of things are around subsector development. Possibly there's been some successes around building subsector infrastructure, linkages around operators, and fostering services that would enable them to operate in a more efficient way. There are cases of organizing embroidery workers by the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, which is a fairly well-known case, organizing poultry producers in Bangladesh by the NGO BRAC. So, the visibility really matters, organizational representation really matters to grab some hold of some power, and recognition as economic agents that contribute to the economy is key. And all of that is really to address a contradiction that I see, which is that informal operators are rarely, if ever, the subject of policy. Economic policy, urban planning policy, social policy. But they are not exempt from the punitive arm of the state, meaning they're penalized when they are trying to make a living and continue to produce. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so now we have 5 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Any questions for our panelists? Please.
So 2 quick questions. Love to know more about how you view the relationship between the formal and informal economy. Often things are passed off to informal people to do things for formal economy. So, and the second question I have for Ben is RCT showing the direct cash transfers are highly effective. I know, just heard a podcast on this. So I'm curious your thought on that. In terms of trying to get microfinance. I realize it's a different industry, but there's plenty of question of just giving people money and not creating a debt structure at all, particularly for the very poor. I'm curious of how you think about that.
Did you want to start?
Why don't you start?
Okay.
I just talked.
Yeah. Great question. I mean, honestly, I think that point of comparison, the impact of unconditional cash transfers versus the impact of like classic microfinance, that is like a deeply motivating comparison for me and a lot of my colleagues working in this area. Like how, it does seem like when you give people like no strings attached cash grants, they seem to put that to more effective use than when you give them a loan that they have to repay on a very strict cadence and with principal and high interest. I will say that comparison is not quite as direct as it might seem. The experiments on unconditional cash transfers are on different populations in general, and so there have been some efforts, and some of them I'm involved in making that comparison direct. But assuming that it's a reasonable comparison, like, yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And basically, like, everything that I presented is sort of in the spirit of trying to make microcredit flexible and useful enough that people can use it the way they would have used a no-strings-attached cash grant. Those are my thoughts there. I mean, I think that's a really important question that we're working to solve.
Yeah, so the question, you sort of have to map the linkages between formal sector firms and informal operators in a fairly local way. I mean, the image we'll have is the global government chains, but there's an awful lot of domestic chains and small ones. And so I know we have researchers within WeGo that sort of map sort of the chain, the product, the whole production, the organization of that subsector to see who is acting what, where is the supply coming from. So that's one thing that you can do. The other thing I think it's also important is they're seen as non-taxpayers. And so we have colleagues that document, for example, the payment of VAT because they buy their supplies. They're never getting any tax abatement for that. And sort of just document the tax contribution through VAT, through market fees, so all the ways in which these activities are taxed in some ways, even if they may not be reporting an income tax at the national level or even the state level.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks for all of your comments. This question is for Manuela. Something that I've been struck by from your research and that of others is the additional power often of adding mental health program components into other types of more traditional development interventions. At the same time, aware of like the scarcity of mental health professionals globally, and I'm sure in a lot of these programs, services are actually being delivered by NGO workers and others. But I would love to hear from you kind of how you think about program quality and scalability of mental health interventions, and like what do we all need to do from a research perspective, from a practice perspective, to be able to scale something that seems like it really is so essential?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and it's a big barrier on the supply side. So a couple of thoughts. First is that for reasons that I don't know, economists have focused mainly on psychotherapy, which is fantastic, but there's also pharmacotherapy. And one of the advantages of pharmacotherapy is that, one, it's been studied for decades. Two, provided that you get access to non-counterfeit meds, then there's better quality control. Three, that a single psychiatrist can treat, thousands of patients. So number one, my suggestion is for scaling up, researchers should consider both psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy. Secondly, is that a number of us are exploring less sort of standard alternatives, such as group therapy, or there are new protocols that the World Health Organization is developing of very short-term cognitive behavioral therapy interventions that maybe with 5 sessions have proven to have some positive impacts. So yeah, there's barriers. Obviously, it takes time to train a new generation of psychiatrists and psychotherapists, but there are also like short-term things that we could do.
Well, thank you, our panelists, for such an insightful presentation and a fruitful discussion. Just to quickly wrap up, we're glad to see that there's involving evidence on the question of how to empower female entrepreneurs, which there's a lot of exciting, innovative credit and skill solutions. But at the same time, as we learned from our session, it's also important to consider the relevance and effectiveness of interventions addressing the broader enabling environment This can be from like regulation, improved infrastructure, to things like social norms and even psychological capacity building. Okay? And again, a huge thank you to our panelists.